This is Android 13 running on the reMarkable Paper Pro. I can install and use Android apps, control the frontlight, connect to Wi-Fi, use Bluetooth keyboards and audio, use the sleep cover and pen wake up, have standby deep sleep functionality, USB connectivity, and I can even use the pen with near stock latency in third-party apps like OneNote. So this is as complete as it gets. But that's not even the best part. The best part is, watch this, I can quickly switch between Android and the stock reMarkable OS. Roughly 30 seconds into the stock UI and a bit faster back into Android. So this is quick enough that I actually use both systems side by side. When I started this project, and actually when I started writing the script for this video, Android on here was much closer to a proof of concept. It booted, apps worked, Wi-Fi worked. Technically you could say the port was functional. But navigating parts of the UI was painfully slow and some fairly basic actions felt borderline unusable. And with only 2 GB of RAM, it didn't take too much to push the whole thing too far. At that point, I was basically making a video to show that Android on the reMarkable Paper Pro could work as a proof of concept. That's not that video anymore. After a lot more optimization, GPU support, and getting USB, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi working, memory tuning specifically around those 2 gigs of RAM, and quite a bit of work on the e-ink side, this has crossed over from interesting experiment into something I genuinely find useful. As you will see, there are still some occasional render defects on the GPU path though, but reducing response time was worth that trade-off, and I'm currently working on eliminating those remaining render issues. I wanted reMarkable's extremely focused note-taking experience while still having the freedom to quickly jump into the handful of apps I'm missing on the stock system. And that's exactly what I got. Kindle is probably the most obvious example. The Paper Pro has this large gallery 3-color display that's great for comics, but actually getting comics onto a stock reMarkable can be surprisingly inconvenient. Hunting everything down as PDFs and transferring it manually gets old very quickly. With Android, I just open Kindle, choose something from my library and start reading. Then there's just general Android flexibility. I can install a browser, use productivity apps, listen to audiobooks, download something directly to the tablet, or connect a Bluetooth keyboard and type in those same applications. And the part that changed the productivity side much more than I expected is the pen. Android properly recognizes the Paper Pro pen as a stylus now. But simply having stylus support wasn't enough for me. On most Android apps, normal rendering introduces enough delay that handwriting quickly becomes unusable. So I implemented a dedicated low latency pen mode that works with third-party apps like OneNote, which was actually a lot more complicated to achieve than I expected. That special pen mode can be enabled with a tap in the navbar. And what makes this particularly useful is that it isn't some OneNote specific hack either. When I enable the low latency pen mode, it works with basically any Android app that accepts pen input. It's essentially using the same trick as Books is using by adding an overlay that is then transferred to the canvas of the app. That changes Android on the Paper Pro from being mostly about content consumption into something that's actually useful for some productivity apps as well. I still prefer the stock reMarkable environment for serious notebooks because the entire experience is built around handwriting. But if I need OneNote or another Android application, the pen no longer feels like a compromise. The same is true for general responsiveness. When I first had Android booting, navigating the interface was one of the biggest reminders that this was a hack. Then I managed to add GPU accelerated rendering for the Android UI, added a special scrolling mode for the e-ink screen, and together with the other optimizations, that made a huge difference. But make no mistake, it's still Android on a slow chipset, with too little RAM and a rather slow e-ink Gallery 3 display, so it's not nearly as fast and responsive as dedicated Android e-ink tablets. But the UI reacts properly, apps launch reliably, and the remaining slowness for the typical apps mostly feels like e-ink slowness rather than this tablet can barely run Android slowness. I also spent a lot of time optimizing Android specifically around those 2 GB of RAM. That number looked like it was going to be the biggest deal breaker when I started. But for the way I'm actually using Android here, one app at a time, the memory limitation has become less intrusive than I expected. It's still noticeable of course, but with a bit of patience totally fine. Some apps like Obsidian are too much for the reMarkable's weak hardware though. And that also brings me to why I chose Android 13 specifically. There are newer Android versions obviously, but for this project I wanted the best balance between modern app compatibility and what actually makes sense on hardware this limited. So after first porting Android 12, I later switched to 13 as the sweet spot for this port for now. That's also why I don't think the takeaway from this project should be that the reMarkable Paper Pro suddenly became a normal Android tablet. But Android only has to be good enough to fill in the gaps left by reMarkable's stock operating system. And after all of these optimizations, it now does that remarkably well, pun intended. I also got deep sleep working, so standby battery drain is just around 0.3% per hour, down from 3% per hour with regular standby when I started. So with over 300 hours of standby time with one charge, it's easily good enough for everyday use. And this whole experiment also made me wonder why basically nobody else is trying Gallery 3 with Android. Almost 2 years after the Paper Pro launched, Gallery 3 is still in this strangely lonely position in the e-ink market. We keep getting new Kaleido 3 tablets every year, but after the mostly failed Big Migueli, nobody has really made another attempt at combining Gallery 3 with Android. After doing this myself, I don't think the display technology is the fundamental problem. One of the most important parts of making Android usable was adding a fast refresh e-ink mode, similar to what we see on purpose-built Android e-ink tablets. That faster mode enables automatically when doing some scrolling, stops once the animation is over, and then refreshes to remove ghosting. I can also switch manually to other render modes through the icon in the navbar. I typically keep it on the regular color mode, which doesn't flicker as often as the full color mode and works well with most apps. Only if I need slightly quicker handling, I switch to one of the monochrome modes manually. Regardless of the mode, the e-ink Gallery 3 display on here is still a lot slower than what you get on e-ink Carta or Kaleido. So even with the faster e-ink mode, you can't watch videos and scrolling also feels less responsive. Besides the e-ink modes, I can also adapt some color settings on a per app basis, though that's rarely needed on the apps I'm using. But it's still nice to have. And when I do need the frontlight, that works from Android too. Again, completely mundane functionality on a normal Android tablet, but considering none of this hardware was ever designed for Android, seeing all of these pieces come together is still pretty satisfying. The appeal of running Android on the reMarkable Paper Pro for me is having both sides. If I just want to write, I stay in reMarkable's stock software, which is still one of the cleanest and most focused note-taking environments you can get. If I want Kindle, Audible, OneNote, or a browser, I switch to Android. For those apps, I also added an overlay note-taking feature that allows me to write directly on the screens in those apps and save these notes. That's not fully fleshed out yet, but useful nonetheless. And even if I want to connect a Bluetooth keyboard with another productivity app, Android is there. And then when I'm finished, I go straight back. That hot switch is really what ties this entire setup together for me. And that's probably the biggest reason my opinion of the device changed so much over the course of this project. When I started writing the script for this video, I thought the conclusion was going to be that Android on the reMarkable Paper Pro is a nice proof of concept. But now the Paper Pro has genuinely jumped into the top 3 of my favorite e-ink tablets. And it's not because this suddenly beats books at Android, it's because I get something I find really appealing from both directions. The focused, polished, reMarkable experience most of the time, and enough expandability to remove the restrictions that used to bother me whenever I need it. It's not perfect yet, but for the most part, it's perfectly usable in everyday use. But let's not forget, there are also a couple of practical downsides to running it. Developer mode is obviously required, so this isn't something you can do while keeping the Paper Pro completely stock. And reMarkable software updates become more complicated, because a normal operating system update writes over the part of the storage Android uses and mostly wipes the Android installation. So updating isn't impossible, but it's no longer the normal over-the-air install and forget process. Android has to be restored afterwards. And that's also the main reason I haven't released the port yet. At this point, I'm actually pretty happy with the functionality. The bigger challenge now is making the installation, update and recovery process safe enough that I'm comfortable handing this to other people. It's one thing to modify my own Paper Pro and know exactly what I changed and can recover it if something goes wrong. It's another thing entirely to build a process that I can tell other people to use on their own devices. So I'm working towards publishing the port, but this last part needs testing and I don't want to rush things to get it out quickly. I also have other reviews and projects to work on, so this might take a little while before everything is polished enough for wider release. What I'll probably do first is open up testing to a smaller group of people who are comfortable helping me find the remaining issues before I make it generally available. So if you have a Paper Pro and they're willing to participate in the testing, or if you just don't want to miss the eventual release, like and subscribe. I'll follow up with a post once I know exactly how I want to proceed with the testing and also find the time in doing it. Thanks for spending your time watching, and I'll see you in the next one.